hellhole, one of the most wicked caves in the world to explore. Located in Santa Cruz, California, a trek through this pitch-black, claustrophobic nightmare consisted of impossibly narrow passageways, dizzying vertical descents, and deadly drops everywhere. And that's why I loved it. The caving, or spelunking community was small, but tightly knit, and craved these death-defying adventures. Why did we do it? Some people love being able to get away from it all. And that was true. When you're 100 feet underground, you may as well be on a different planet. For me, it was the adrenaline rush. When my childhood friend and fellow caver Zeke told me he'd found an entirely new cave while camping, just a stone's throw away from hellhole, I couldn't book my flight fast enough. I arrived at the Wilder Ranch State Park and pulled up next to Zeke's car. I stepped out of my car and approached Zeke, who was grabbing gear from his trunk. There was someone with him I didn't recognize. He was tall but slim, and was bald with striking gray eyes. "Jack," Zeke said to me, then glanced over at the man. "This is Gunther. I met him when I went to Oktoberfest. He's caved all over Europe. He's here on vacation and wanted to join us." "Cool," I said, shaking Gunther's hand. He nodded at me. "Nice to meet you," he said in a thick German accent. "Is Kyle coming?" I asked. Zeke shook his head. "Flight canceled due to bad weather. He's stuck in Canada. Might be a couple days. He's pissed." After exchanging pleasantries, we headed towards the cave, directly opposite the direction of where hellhole was. About 10 minutes later, we arrived at a rock-covered hole behind a bush. "I didn't want anyone to accidentally find it and fall in, so I covered the entrance up," Zeke said, pulling the rocks away. The entrance was about the size of a manhole covering. I shined my light into it and saw that it was a 10-foot drop right off the bat. "Did you explore any?" Gunther asked Zeke. Just a little. There's a slight downward sloping birth canal right away, probably 100 feet. There are one or two cracks with light on the way down as well. It opens into a small room, but it's pitch black in there, and that's why I had to turn around because I didn't have a headlamp." "Okay, let's double check our gear and head in," I said. Our gear consisted of special hard hats with LED headlamps, backup flashlights, glow sticks, various tools, ropes, a first aid kit, some snacks, and water. We were also wearing flexible, grippy climbing boots, grippy climbing gloves, and knee and elbow pads. Zeke also had a GoPro to document the excursion. "Alright guys, it's supposed to start raining at 2 p.m. and this cave will definitely flood, so we have a hard return time of noon. No point in risking it, and that still gives us almost 6 hours in there," I said. Everyone nodded. Zeke pulled his GoPro off his hard hat and tapped it. "Damn it, I forgot to change the battery," he swore. He rifled through his bag and then sighed. "I left the spare in the car. Y'all go on ahead and get through the birth canal. I'll catch up to you." Before either of us could argue, he took off. Gunther and I exchanged looks. "Should we wait?" he asked. I shook my head. "Nah, let's get in there. I'm dying to see it. We'll just wait in the room after we get past the birth canal." And with that, I climbed in. I descended the 10-foot drop by pushing my feet up against both sides of the cave entrance and then inching down until I could drop the last 5 feet. I gave Gunther a thumbs up before clicking on my headlamp and plunging headfirst into the birth canal. It lived up to its namesake. Remember those tight tubes that you would climb through in playgrounds as a kid? Now shrink it down by 50%. Make it cold, slippery, and so tight that you might get stuck at any second. I shimmied down the chute for a few minutes. It narrowed, and I realized my hard hat wouldn't make the squeeze. Since my hands were splayed out in front of me, I slowly pulled the hard hat off and pushed it in front of me, then continued onwards. It was still too tight. The walls of this chute were pressing down on my chest from all angles. I couldn't get a deep breath in at all. I tried to wriggle backwards, but couldn't get any purchase. Was I stuck? Panic started to creep in. Zeke was a little guy. Had he unknowingly gotten me stuck 40 feet below the earth by not realizing I couldn't fit? This tunnel was barely bigger than a basketball. But then I steeled myself. Zeke knew what he was doing, and he wouldn't have made so simple a mistake. More so, this wasn't my first time. I knew what I had to do. I exhaled fully and watched a little dust kick up in front of my face. Once the last ounce of air left my lungs, I felt the ceiling pull off my back. I kicked forward and continued onwards, and the walls lit up a little more so I could breathe shallow. After what felt like a good 10 minutes, I heard my hard hat slide over a rocky edge and hit the floor. Lights spilled up in the room in front of me, and I breathed a sigh of relief. I pulled myself out of the birth canal and took a breather. After catching my breath and putting my hard hat back on, I glanced up into the birth canal. The downward slope was slight, so I could just make out Gunter's chin about 50 feet away. "It gets real tight," I yelled into the canal. "You'll have to exhale fully." "Yeah, I'm about to reach that spot," he replied. I turned away and shined my headlamp around the room. It was about 10 feet by 10 feet with a ceiling around 8, so decently sized. The rock walls were slightly wet, and I saw a couple spiders skittering about. To the side of the room was a hole about 3 feet high that led further into the cave. I glanced inside and saw a narrow passageway that ended in a blind turn. Lastly, next to the entrance of the birth canal was an elevated ledge. Satisfied, I took my hard hat off, leaned back, and waited for Gunter to arrive. About 10 minutes later, Gunter reached the end. I grabbed one of his hands and pulled him out. He sat down heavily, taking off his hard hat and rubbing his sweaty bald head with his shirt. "Okay, now we will wait," he muttered, before leaning back and closing his eyes. About 30 minutes went by, during which we rested and talked a little. I glanced at my watch. It was nearly 8 a.m. now. "He's gotta be in the birth canal by now," I said. I turned to the entrance and peered into the shaft, but saw nothing. "Zeke," I called. No answer. I started to lean back, but then noticed a beam of light filling the canal. A moment later, I could just make out Zeke's chin. "He's on the way," I said. "Good." I glanced back into the tunnel and saw Zeke's face come fully into view. He looked at me, and I narrowed my eyebrows. He looked pale, as if he was freezing. He was also expressionless, except for his eyes, which flashed darkly at me under the shine of my light. "Zeke?" I asked, startled. Zeke took off his hard hat, which blocked my view of him. I sat back, a little troubled. "Something wrong?" Gunter asked. I shrugged. "I don't think so." The next 10 minutes went by slowly as we listened to the sound of Zeke wriggling his way down the birth canal. It seemed that he struggled immensely to get through. "Don't forget, you have to exhale at the tight spot to make that squeeze," I yelled into the birth canal. I pulled back, very confused at this point. It took Zeke 40 minutes in total to get through, according to my estimate, which again didn't make sense. Finally, he reached the exit. Gunter and I both grabbed a hand and pulled Zeke out of the birth canal. As we pulled, I realized something indeed was not right. The hand I pulled was large and had a crushing grip. The hand released to grasp the side of the exit, and Zeke pulled himself out. Gunter and I stared in confusion as Zeke righted himself in front of us. His body was all wrong. Zeke was a small guy, no more than 5'5", but he was now easily 6'2", with powerful arms and broad shoulders. "Was zum Teufel?" Gunter breathed. Zeke's face was still completely expressionless and looked even paler than it had been 30 minutes ago. It was milk white. Zeke turned to me and those dark eyes flashed maniacally at me. At the same time, a thin line of blood trickled down his throat. And then it clicked in my head. This wasn't Zeke. This was somebody else. And he was wearing Zeke's face. Suddenly, the man pulled a massive combat knife out of a sheath on his forearm. The stainless steel glinted under the light of his headlamp. Gunter turned to me. "Run." The man lurched forward and plunged the knife into Gunter's chest. He ripped it out, and a spray of blood splattered my face. It stopped, and then sprayed again a half second later. Then it stopped, sprayed again, stopped, and again. I screamed and dove headfirst blindly into the 3-foot hole at the end of the room. I hit the ground face first, and my hard hat went flying off my head, sending a beam of light spinning around the room before disappearing down the passageway. I scrambled to my feet, tasting blood in my mouth and feeling a spike of pain in my nose, which was immediately followed by a trickle of blood down my lips and chin, issuing from my nostrils. A sickly crack echoed through the passageway. I turned towards the 3-foot hole as the man approached it. Gunter's severed head dropped through the hole. It hit the ground with a wet thud and then rolled to a stop at my feet. I tried to scream again, but my pounding heart was in my throat. Then, the snow-white face of Zeke poked through the hole, and those vile eyes stared hungrily at me. Gulping blood, I turned heel and sprinted for the end of the room, where the blind turn was. I rounded it and gasped. It was a vertical cliff, which I had just stepped off of. I howled as I felt myself fall and flung my hands out for something to grab. My right hand found purchase on a jagged rock edge, and I gripped it for everything I had. The rock sliced my palm, but I did not let go, wincing as the knife edge dug deeper into my flesh. I threw my other hand up onto the edge for support, and then looked down into the pitch-black abyss, unable to see what was beneath me. Carefully, I withdrew my bleeding right hand and fumbled for my fanny pack. I unzipped it and withdrew a glow stick. I jammed it against the rock wall, cracking it, and then dropped it below me. It fell for about 40 feet before stopping. A light shined on me, illuminating my precarious position on the rock wall. I glanced up and saw the face of Zeke staring at me from under his headlamp. He disappeared for a second, then reappeared with a bundle of ropes. My stomach flipped. I had to get down first. Throwing caution to the wind, I scrambled down the rock wall, my bloody right hand slipping as I did. I made it down halfway before losing my grip and falling the rest of the way. Darkness. I took a sputtering breath as I came to in a heap on the rock. The first thing I noticed was the sound of a hammer striking a nail. I opened my eyes and saw 2 ropes snaking down the cliff face. The hammering stopped, and the man began to climb down the ropes. He was taking his time. I glanced at my watch and saw that it was nearly 10 a.m. I'd been out of it for more than an hour, long enough for him to set up those ropes. I clambered painfully to my feet, my breath catching in my chest when my tailbone wailed at me in pain. I ignored it and hobbled away. The man reached the bottom, and I saw that he wasn't running. He was walking, stalking me. It made sense. The only way out was back the way we came. I was trapped, and he knew it. There was no need to run. If he wasn't going to run, neither would I. I slowed my gait a little, just enough to prevent any more blind cliff jumps. I staggered down the passage, which continued for a good 10 minutes. Whenever I noticed the shine of his headlamp, I picked up the pace, and the pain of my tailbone increased every time. My nose was broken. My right hand was cut open. My tailbone was certainly broken, and upon reaching into my mouth, I pulled out a bloody canine and 2 molars. I also likely had a minor concussion because my head was pounding. I felt my scalp, and some blood on my fingers confirmed the injury. I had no weapon, and nearly all of my gear was still sitting in the room next to the birth canal. All I had was a flashlight and a half-dozen glow sticks in a fanny pack. I was running through an unexplored cave that could end at any moment, and I had no way to defend myself. The pain in my tailbone spiked, and I puked on the rocky floor. It was mostly the blood that I had been swallowing. The light of his headlamp illuminated me, and I took off again. I reached a narrow chute, not as tight as the birth canal, but would still take time to push through. I steeled myself and climbed in. Running on instinct and muscle memory, I quickly passed through and climbed out into a new passageway that continued on for some distance. How deep did this cave go? We were easily hundreds of feet below the earth, and it was starting to get quite cold. I shivered, knowing that we would have never gone this deep on the first excursion. I glanced back into the chute and saw Zeke's blank face as the man struggled through it. Struggled was the key word here. He was having a lot of difficulty. A light bulb went off in my head. Whoever this monster was, he wasn't a spelunker. His body type was wrong, for starters. I personally couldn't believe he'd managed to squeeze through the birth canal at all with those broad shoulders, and doing so took him nearly 40 minutes, when I did it in a quarter that time. It also took him more than an hour to set up those ropes. This freak was a novice at best. This could even be his first time in a cave. That said, he wasn't letting lack of experience stop him. I checked my watch. It was close to 11 now. It would take an hour plus to get back to the surface in my condition, and by then, rain may have started to flood the cave. Such worries were pointless, because in order to get out, I would have to get past him, which was never going to happen because he'd gut me like a fish. There was no telling how much deeper the cave went, but at some point, it would end or become impassable, and he would reach me. I had to figure out a way to get past him. I took a deep breath and tried to think of a plan. There was a loose stone on the ground. I picked it up and weighed it in my hand, a good 6 or 7 pounds. If I lied in ambush by the chute, I might be able to surprise him and strike his head, but it was risky. And even if I did manage to kill him, his body would probably plug the chute and might get stuck. trapping me. Within a few hours, I'd be drowned underwater. I closed my eyes and saw those powerful hands of his seizing the rock from mine and then beating me to death with it. No, I needed a different way. Some way I could trap him, or at least get around him and back up through the cave. Once he was behind me, he'd never catch up before I got out. Then, I could make a dash for my car in the parking lot. The key was in my fanny pack. A wave of pain suddenly struck me and I wobbled on my feet. I put my non-injured hand out and steadied myself. Yeah, fighting was definitely not going to work. I'm 5'9", 140 pounds soaking wet and beat up. This guy was 6'2" and easily 215 with a knife. I didn't have a chance in hell head to head. I stepped forward into the passage and looked around for anything. I rounded a few more turns, ducked under a low overhead, and stepped over a pit that dropped into what looked bottomless. This continued on for some time. The path was tricky, and I knew it would hold him up trying to navigate it. Eventually, I came to a long hallway of sorts. At the end was a narrow gap you could shimmy through, but next to it was an impossibly tight mini birth canal. I walked up the narrow gap and looked through. It went on about 50 feet before opening up. I shimmied through it. It was tight, but nothing the big freak couldn't handle. The wall was crumbly, though, and a few pebbles landed on my head as I worked my way through. Suddenly, I felt the ground shift and the rocks screeched. I gasped and pushed through as fast as possible before spilling out the exit. I glanced back and watched a large stone fall into the gap. Not enough to cover it, though. The passageway shivered but stabilized. But if that freak came through that with all his weight... I turned forward, and my heart sank. I'd reached the end. A complete dead end, smooth rock stared back at me. It was just a cramped little room, no more than 6 feet across. This was the end. And so, the wait began as I tried to think of a plan. I knew that eventually he would reach me. I checked my watch. It was 1 p.m., an hour past the deadline of our hard return. I'd spent over an hour in this room, racking my brain, trying to think of something that could save me. It would probably take 2 to 3 hours to return from here, and by then most of this could be underwater. I had to do something. At that moment, a light fell on my face. He had finally reached the gap. This little rock closet would be my doom. Gunter's severed head flashed in my vision, then mine. I just wanted to see the sun again, smell fresh air. I pounded my left hand against the walls and screamed. The howl bounced around the rock walls and my splitting headache doubled. He was looking at me. The harsh light on my face was the dead giveaway. I glanced back into the narrow gap and saw Zeke's face, watching me blankly as he slowly inched through it. The stainless steel knife was in his hand. I had maybe another 5 minutes until he possibly reached the end. Even now, he was stepping over the stone that had fallen down. I sat down and closed my eyes, praying for a miracle. I opened my eyes. The mini birth canal stared back at me. I shakily got to my feet and peered at it. A child couldn't fit through this. How could I? It made the entrance birth canal look like a bad joke. But if I could get in there and somehow get through before he reached the end of the gap, noticed I was gone, and went back the other way, I would be in front of him. I stuck my head in to test it. Maybe it was possible. It had to be. If it didn't, I was dead. If I didn't try it, I was dead. I pulled my head out and shined the light into it to properly judge the tightness of the passage. No. It was impossible. I would never fit. Under the light, I could properly see how tight it became. This would be my doom. My only option was to try to get around him and back in the gap. When he stepped out, maybe I could dive past him for the gap, or throw a stone at him for distraction. It was all I could do. And then I heard a screech of rock, followed by a biblical roar. I looked into the gap and gaped as I saw stones plummeting behind the man, a cave-in. There would be no escape through the gap now. He took off wildly towards me in an effort to get out. The mini birth canal and certain death was my only option. What would be worse, being stabbed to death or being stuck until I drowned? I had to try to make this squeeze. Frantically, I ripped off my boots, pants, socks, fanny pack, knee and elbow pads, and even my shirt. Nearly everything was cast off so I'd have a better chance of making the squeeze. Gripping my flashlight and a glow stick in my good hand and my car keys in my bad, I climbed into the mini birth canal in only my underwear and climbing gloves. Madness. Utter madness. I got stuck immediately. It was my shoulders. I gritted my teeth and cranked my whole body into the corkscrew. I moved an inch. More. I squirmed, wiggled, and shoved further. Behind me, I heard him exit the gap, followed by the pounding of stones. The gap was surely closed off for good. There was no other way out but here. I couldn't see him, but I suddenly felt a hand grab my foot. I screamed and pushed myself harder into the stone. His hand slipped, and then he was out of reach. But I was stuck again. I exhaled fully and tried to move. No dice. I strained, and the crushing rock walls clamped down on me. I took one shallow breath and then forcefully exhaled again, squeezing every last ounce of air from my lungs. My shoulder found a gap, and I pushed forward. I took another shallow breath and exhaled hard again and again. Little by little, I wormed through this impossibly narrow tunnel until I was once again stuck. I tried the exhale trick, but that failed. In fact, now I could barely breathe at all. The corners of my vision started to constrict. The rock walls closed in around me, pushing into me, pressing down on all sides, encasing me for it. I bit my tongue hard, then bit it again even harder and felt blood well up. I pushed it out of my mouth and let it dribble down my chin and onto my bare chest. A slight bit of lubrication. Gripping the rock in front of me with my outstretched hands, I pulled for all I had and moved again. My head was cranked fully horizontal and my neck was screaming at me, but I pressed onwards. And then I ground to a halt. Once more, I exhaled hard. But no luck. I was surely stuck this time. I pictured my body, permanently trapped, being found by the first responders. It was bloated from the water, and my glassy eyes stared blankly at the four walls of my stone coffin. No, there was but one last thing I could try. I emptied my bowels. The smallest of a gap opened up and pulled for everything I had. My ribs clicked, and then I felt my lowest rib break fully. My shoulders cracked. I could feel the bones of my skull compressing. My pelvis bent. My vision shrunk to a tiny dot. The rock flattened me until I fell forward into running water. I gasped for air and erupted into a coughing fit. Finally, it ceased. I looked up into the paralyzing darkness. I grabbed my flashlight, which had fallen in the water before me, and clicked it on. It didn't come on. It had been smashed at some point during my frantic struggle. I felt around in the void and found the glow stick. The passageway was illuminated in eerie green. The air was thick with dust from the cave-in. I looked at my near-naked body. My legs and arms were covered in scrapes and blood from the squeeze. My chest, too. Even my face had been rubbed raw. I shined the glow stick into the water and felt around until I found my car keys. A harsh light illuminated me, and I glanced back into the mini birth canal. Zeke's face was watching me. He had no chance. He wouldn't even be able to fit those shoulders of his into the entrance, let alone get through. I stared at Zeke's face and then bored my eyes into the killer's eyes. "This is your tomb now, motherfucker." His eyes, once maniacal, now flashed with fear and then panic. I turned my back on him, and he began to scream behind me. It was animalistic and wretched. The water was rising and quick. I pushed forward, ignoring sharp pricks in my bare feet from the rocks. My breathing was ragged, and each breath made my lowest rib groan. I had to keep going. I nearly stepped in the bottomless pit since it was now invisible underwater, but remembered at the last second where it was. I reached the chute, now going upwards, and entered. Water was rushing down, hitting my face like a jet. I clambered up, slipped, fell, tailbone exploded in pain. Tried again. This time I found footing, and I pushed up it. I reached the top and kept going. Dizzy, but alive, I eventually reached the cliff I'd fallen off. A flood of water was cascading down it. The water was up to my neck now. I was shivering uncontrollably, but I was so close. I grasped the ropes and ascended. At some point on the cliff face, I blacked out, but came too near the top. I couldn't stop shaking. I climbed over the edge, battling the river of water that was slamming into me. At last, I reached the 10 by 10 room. The birth canal was an impassable geyser of water, but most was going into the 3-foot-high hole. Gunter's headless body was face down in about 2 inches of water. Forgive me. I pulled his jacket off, and his pants and boots. I wrung the clothes out, put them on, and then grabbed the first aid kit from the little gear bag. I pulled out a trauma blanket, went to the elevated ledge, and threw it over me before passing out. Hours later, the geyser finally stopped. I grabbed Gunter's headlamp and made the final trek through the birth canal and out of the cave. At the entrance, I found Zeke's body. It was bloated from the water, and his bloody skull and dangling eyes stared at me as I passed by. I heaved myself up the 10 feet and out into the night air. The entire area was flooded. I stumbled to the parking lot, opened my car door, and drove away. First responders were incapable of getting through the birth canal safely, but Kyle, who arrived 2 days after this happened, was a cop, and he assembled a few local spelunkers to make the recovery. They went down there with all the gear and a pistol, just in case. They were able to get Gunter's body out of the cave via ropes, pulleys, and lubricants. His head, however, was not found. Kyle and the crew, needing to confirm my story, headed deeper into the cave. They reached the bottom and peered into the mini birth canal. The waterlogged body of the freak was wedged inside, forever stuck. They said it looked like he'd broken both of his shoulders trying to squeeze through it. And he was still wearing Zeke's face.